Hello, everyone. Um, as it was said, I've been an MC at many conferences. I have never spoken at a conference, so bear with me today. I'll try to do my best. So usually it's like 5 minutes in between talks. Today is going to be longer. Anyways, so a little bit about me. Put a bunch of stuff because I realized I didn't had an introduction for. It's like I didn't think about it. So if you're curious, this is some of the things, some of the platforms you can find me at. Usually that's my handle. Sometimes it's slightly different, but I'm mostly there. I don't post a lot these days because reasons. I mean, once Twitter was gone, it was gone. I'm like, hey, what can you do? You can find a little bit more information about me at my personal website. It's just, kind of like my visiting card, so you can go there and see my section about me, about now, so what I'm doing lately. Probably the fastest thing to reach me is actually writing an email to me, so do that. And if you want to listen to some of my ramblings together with a friend of mine, we have a podcast. We haven't published anything lately because I'm in between jobs. But I'm going to start working again very soon, so probably there's going to be something new coming soon. But we have almost 2 years of episodes, so you're not going to get bored. About today, as I was introduced, we're going to talk about what happens when it's a story about success, but sometimes success can actually be unexpected. You think you are prepared, but you're actually not. The story that I'm going to tell you today about, it's actually happened already some time in the past. I was 6 months in my first job as an engineering manager, so I never experienced anything like that. To be successful, usually you have to be at the right place at the right time. I think I was at the right place, or there. At that time, I was working for Freeletics. As we said, this was it's an application for fitness. It's pretty successful in Germany. Some of you might know it. We had a bunch of different stuff. We had a nutrition application at that time. So you could also not only get healthy by training, but also by having the right nutrition. We created personalized training plans for you with what would now be called AI. It was machine learning back then. So we would also figure out, based on your performance compared to other people, how good you were doing. You could give us feedback about how the training was. Was it too hard, too little? You wanted to change days and whatnot. So we would prepare. It was actually a personalized plan. It was not just I've seen other apps, what they do. We also introduced, this was an experiment, it's called Mindset Coaching. It was some sort of like small podcasts and whatnot. It was supposed to be something new that would fall into the track of the personalized AI, but it was a demo, so. It was pretty successful because on a regular month, this is operating month, we had something like 10,000 new registration per day. We had something like 20,000 training users per day. The company at that time had something like 48 million registered users. Active users were kind of like, I think, 600,000 overall. So, I mean, it's not a small application. It's not Netflix, but, it's doing its own things. A peak month would be slightly different. It would be almost double the registrations, more than double the training per day. We were prepared for that stuff because we knew how the pattern of our users would be. So, for example, a peak month would be something like January, fitness. Yeah, exactly. It's like, when you go to the gym, it was the same, but the good thing is that you could train anywhere, anytime. You can train in your apartment, you don't need a lot of equipment, so it was easily accessible. And this meant that in January, we would make as much money as the rest of the year. So it was a pretty important month for the year. This also meant that our DevOps team was very well aware that they had to pump up the infrastructure. And of course, we could handle that much traffic. So our infrastructure was pretty, I mean, I'm saying basic, it's pretty normal for a company our size, the kind of, also how the company was organized. So you have your clients, they hit a load balancer. We had some Kubernetes that would handle the different servers where we would have the different applications and whatnot. We had some database, read replicas, different regions for redundancy and whatnot. We had some Redis for cache. So, I mean, nothing, it's not rocket science. Our app architecture, when I joined the company, this was 6 years before, we had a Rails monolith. But we figured out that if we wanted to add more users and more features to our application, we had to go into a slightly different direction, and this would have been, we never went really microservices or more service-oriented architecture because there are downsides to microservices. Our team wasn't big enough to actually handle that kind of like operational overhead, but we tried to slice and dice the application in such a way that we had different services that would represent different domains. We had our training system, we had our authentication system, we called it payments. It was, I mean, misnaming, but naming is hard. It was basically an authorization system. So we would check, have you paid? Have you not paid? What have you paid for? Blah, blah, blah. So that service, the third one, that would be the one that would actually check if you were allowed to have the paid version of the product or not. Without the paid version, you couldn't do shit. So we had the nutrition. This was its own app because we had a Rails monolith. And at that time, we thought, if we want another product, why not spin up another Rails application? So we had a completely other, it was basically the same, but then we started using the services to reduce overhead. The Mind Coach, that was the, well, would I call it test? Nah, was more like a demo, MVP kind of thing, but we decided to try and have it already encapsulated so that we didn't have to then redo all the work. I mean, we had already a bunch of services that we could reuse. We had a bunch of stuff to do marketing, advertisement, communication, and whatnot. The infamous GDPR law hit us at some point, so we had our own service built around that. And to manage all of that, we had some, we were using mostly synchronous calls because, I mean, we could handle it. We were using for more critical things on the critical path. For example, I don't know, you're creating a new subscription. So you are paying for the first time. We don't want to lose that, so it's pretty important. So we would have that on Sidekick, for example, so that we could retry if something was going wrong and so on. And then we started, a couple of months before, we started to introduce a message bus because all the synchronous call, we already were seeing that it was starting to become pretty chaotic. This was mostly the operation team that were like, guys, this is not gonna work for a very long time. And we on the back end were like, but that's okay for now. So we started introducing that. But as I said, you need to be at the right time too. That happened. That happened. We all know, remember what this means. COVID started. And I mean, at first, it wasn't too big of a deal for us because, I mean, people were keeping working and living as usual. But at some point, first COVID death and the German government decided to go into lockdown. What does this mean? This is the 21st of March. This is how it looked. So, as I was telling you, this is our peak month. The yellow line, these are registrations. The blue lines, these are trainings. So you can see the pattern every day. So this is people waking up, training at the end of the day. This is night, blah, blah, blah. Registrations. a lot of people have a lot of ideas in January. They usually don't, they don't follow up for that. But this is what it looked like at some point here. They announced the lockdown, and basically overnight, we saw this huge spike. As I said, these are registrations. At that point, fitness studios were closed, so people kept training. And this means a lot of money, right? Kind of. It meant that we went up to 50K registrations. So as you can see, compared to a peak month or a regular month, that was a shitload of traffic. This was pretty much the double for training users. We had that much of increase of people actually using the app on the, I mean, if you register once, right? But if you train, you hit up the training app at least 3 times a week, probably. So it's a lot. So this means money, right? It doesn't. I mean, yes, it does at some point, but you know, it kind of started snowballing because here you can see requests per minute. Stuff is fine. Stuff is kind of fine. No, not fine anymore. This is where 6 p.m. Was the time of the day in which most of the people would train because it's the end of your day, right? So you close your laptop, like, okay, let me wind down, let me train. And this was more our operation team that started noticing this pattern because this happened basically between Friday and Sunday. So most of us, back-end guys, we were home doing our own stuff. The operations guys, they were on call. So they started getting a few alarms. And yeah, so a bunch of errors that pretty much match the request per minute. So that's a direct correlation. This one, I mean, this screenshot I took afterwards, of course, as you can see, it's like 31st of March. This is our nickname for what I'm going to tell you next, later. We had a small problem with DNSs. The first problem that we encountered was that, as I said, we were using a lot of synchronous calls. This, on a normal day of operation, wouldn't be that big of a deal. You have a bunch of services. This is just an example. It's not, it's in no way it's actually representing what's going on. But, you know, you want to train, you fire up your app, you call the authentication system that says, yeah, this is a user. The authentication system asks the payment system, has this user paid? Do they have access to the product or not? Our payment system's like, is it time to hit them with maybe a discount or something like that? So a bunch of calls going back and forth. And the problem is that once one starts to fail, then the other starts to fail. And you have a cascading issue of applications starting to, especially the sidekicks, started to accumulate and accumulate. And those don't go away, right? So once the sidekick runs, then it goes back and back and back. So you have this, if the application is not responding, all of these were Rails application. If an application is not responding, it's not going to respond if you hit it more, usually. So that was the first problem. The second problem we had was, oh, sorry, yeah, I forgot. I switched some slides yesterday. So as a countermeasure to this, what we did was, this is it. The second problem we had was the autoscaler. This was an easy one to fix. So we had on our infrastructure, we were using Kubernetes. You just spin up some pods, all good, right? You have more servers, blah, blah. But our autoscaler was not geared for that kind of traffic at that time of the year because, again, we weren't expecting that. Countermeasures, that was an easy one to fix. You just increase the autoscaler. That's fine. That's what the operation team did during the weekend. And okay, it kind of worked out because we could wait for Monday then for the actual shit. And we decided to add some cache in between the different services so that we didn't have to have always super fresh information. was mostly like every 15 minutes we would drop the cache if there was no hit. It kind of worked out for the first couple of days, but that's when the second problem happened. On Monday, many people, because it's Monday, you start to train again. So the requests got even worse. And here we had 4 different problems. That's why it was called DNS hell by the operations team. At that point in time, the DNS service for Kubernetes wasn't supporting caching names. They did after this version, but unfortunately at that time it didn't. So for our internal calls, we would see, of course, also an increase of calls. And this would add to the problems that we were already having from more calls coming from the outside world. Because also people are kind of lazy, we were using short DNS names for our internal calls. So instead of using, I don't know, bodyweight.sbn dot blah 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 .io, we were using bodyweight.sbn. And for how it was structured at that point, Kubernetes would require 2 DNS resolutions per request, because you first need to resolve the short DNS name, and then you need to resolve the long one. We also were using, some internal calls would call for external addresses, and because of no caching, also this meant that we were asking AWS route 53, this is the DNS server service on AWS, for internal calls as well, and that meant that at some point AWS was like, you're out of quota, so you can't call anything else anymore. This means no payments, no marketing service. Some of our content was hosted on an external service because it was just easier, so we had outsourced that part. So also your marketing content is not spinning up, your paywall doesn't show up your products and whatnot. And Sidekick, we thought that would solve problems, right? Sidekick retries and keeps retrying, so this means more and more calls. All of this meant that like the application wasn't working at all, but at an infrastructure level. This was not even a problem from the software perspective, but what did we do? More cache. Guess what? We had a policy that we didn't want to have too much cache because, I mean, cache is, it's hard to find the problems where they are if you have problems. Sometimes you don't notice you have a problem until it's very, very late. So our policy from a backend perspective was to have as little cache as possible. We had to do it. In this specific case, it was a slightly different cache because it was on the infrastructure side. So we moved to core DNS. This was done overnight by the operations team, of course. We rewrote some of the internal API calls to use the long names so that we could avoid the double calls to the DNS servers. And also, instead of using the public available addresses, because again, lazy, so we were like, oh, bodyweight.freeletics.com, we started using the internal names so that we didn't have to have more calls externally, and this would reduce the quota that would reduce the calls that were matching the quotas, that were filling up the quotas. And the third problem we have, the fourth, was we had a bunch of circular dependencies. You know how people say about Conway's law, how your architecture reflects on your teams and vice versa. We had service-oriented architecture. This means that we had quite complex domains for multiple teams to master. So kind of naturally, each one of our teams, we had 6 teams at that point, was becoming the owner of a particular domain. So if someone had to work on something specific, let's say our training system or our payment system, you had a go-to team to go to. But this also meant that they started to become more and more isolated. And sometimes this happens, you don't know exactly what to call, maybe there's already a call there happening, blah, 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 so what do we do? Circular dependencies just happen. We weren't really prepared for, it never showed up in any of our previous good months. We never thought we had this problem. But actually, that's what happened. Especially when we started working with this external system. This was a CMS that we were using for our marketing service. This was done by completely new, by a different team, and stuff just happens. Like here, it's just an example of one of our calls. This was the call that we were using to build just the paywall. And we were hitting like 4 or 5 different services. Some of them, here it's not shown, but some of them were talking to each other too, and that was the problem. So for example, the user, this is the authentication system, was calling the payment system, as I said, to figure out if it had any subscription, would get an answer back. Then the training system would also double check about that, like some other calls were important, so it would start calling that. So we saw a big increase here of calls on this one that we considered kind of like an internal service, and this meant that we didn't pump that one up as much as the one that we're facing the external world, means the training and the authentication service. Of course, that one started failing first. So what did we do? This was the easy part, let's say, because we figured out which were the calls that were causing problems. The cache helped a lot already, but also we started seeing this, identifying the circular dependencies, and we started collecting them, and over the weeks, we started removing them. We also noticed that we had some calls that weren't providing any more value anymore. Like these were just things that, like we were talking about technical debt and how to fix it before. Those 20% of the week that your company offers you to do cleanup, use it. So we had a bunch of those, and those were just, they were completely useless, especially within the different services. Those were not important anymore. We managed to hold the situation, to hold the fort. The application actually, I think, broke down only once, and this was very early, before the operations teams started to call also for help from the backend team. What I remember about that time is that it really felt like, so you had your usual working day, and then you knew that at 6 p.m. people would start training. So my manager was very smart at that time, VP of engineering. He set up this war room. This was we were all working from home at that point. This was a meetup call that was open the whole day, and anyone could jump in. There were usually 2 or 3 people always in there, especially the operations guys. And it was used to coordinate, but also to get updates from the technical part. And anyone could just jump in and help out. So if you wanted to have an update, or if you had some free time, 6 p.m., you would join there and like, okay, what's on fire? Let me help. So we had that. We used Slack a lot. Not so much for the technical people, because as I said, we had the war room, but it was very useful for communicating towards the rest of the company. I mean, this is a critical time for the company from a business perspective. If you don't serve your paying users, of course, people will drop. Freeletics is pretty famous in Germany, so it would also be bad PR, and it will have long-term consequences. So making sure that the rest of the company knew what was going on, what we were doing to fix it, if there was any danger, if they had to react via, I don't know, like social media or anything like that, was super important. And also that helped a lot. This was It was mostly my manager keeping up the communication towards the rest of the company, but that was super useful because then the people that were to handle the actual problems, the incidents at this point, could focus on that, because nobody would come to us and actually ask us what was going on. They had someone to use as a reference. That was also the time we started using a status page. I mean, you can use any service like that. At this point, there are so many, but that's when we started using status page, and that was helpful because you could, as a Freeletics employee, you could subscribe to that, and you would receive notifications if something was up or down, what was up, what was down. That was especially useful for the marketing team, because the marketing team kept working as normal, and this, again, was a big business opportunity. So, of course, they were pumping out a lot of marketing messages out there, campaigns and whatnot. So, but we needed to coordinate with them on when to do this, because it can be dangerous, you know? So overall, this took us to have it under control. It took us kind of like 2 weeks. But the good part was that nobody noticed that there was a problem. So that was the nice outcome, and that was something that we were actually pretty proud of. What we did during this time was also using a Miro board. Again, you can use whatever tool you want, but this was really like a whiteboard where whoever thought there was a problem and an easy to approach solution to that problem was like, oh, we noticed this, put a sticker in there. Anyone, as I said, could come into the war room, get access to the Miro board, and pick a task. So there were also a bunch of people, not only from the backend, sometimes we also had some things on the clients. These were iOS and Android native clients, so it's not like you can hook up some React and do stuff, like have to know what you're doing there. They could just come, pick up a task, and fix it. So it was really a team effort, and it was very nice because as one of the engineering manager at that point, I didn't really had to ask anyone of my team to do any of those things, but they just showed up. So it was also, in a way, one of those moments in which you come together as a team, and it shows, it's basically the outcome of a long, long time of taking care of each other as a team and as managers and reports. So that was a nice one. So 2 weeks for fixing this. Sorry guys. For fixing this, patching kind of. With my manager, what we thought, we as engineering managers and our VP of engineering, that this was the right time, because like usually when things work out, people in the rest of the company, the other departments, they don't notice the work you're doing for keeping everything working nicely and smoothly. So I was like, this is the perfect chance. We can actually use this as a way to advertise the fact that we might need to clean up some technical debt there if we want to be prepared for the next successful campaign. Also, at that point in time, we didn't know anyone, no one actually would know if this would be the only lockdown. We had no idea. This was in March. Who knows what's happened next? So if we want to survive another of these waves, we need to fix this for good. So what we did was we planned. So we planned in the sense that my manager came to me and was like, okay, if you give me some ammo, I can go to the planning sessions for the next OKRs, and I can try and bring this to the company level. And we actually did it. It was the only engineering team OKR we had for a very long time. The trick there was that we tried to frame it in such a way that it wasn't connecting so much to the emergency we had, but it was more looking forward. So what if we want to keep being so successful? What if we want to make our marketing campaigns even more useful, more we increased the top line, but we also decreased the bottom line. So we really tried to focus on how to make this about making more money and saving money. So I'm not going to read all of this. I mean, you can find my slides on speaker deck. I'll put them later. But like, I just want for you to pay some attention to the bolded words. As you can see, everything is either tied to making the marketing team more successful. This means they could send, at that time, it took us 24 hours to send out a push notification campaign to all our users. That's a very long time, especially if you want to do something like discounts, things like this. It's not ideal that some users have them and some users don't. So we focused on that thing. We focused on having lower marketing spending, because the faster you are, the fewer money you have to spend on Facebook, for example. You have to spend on social media. The request to our customer service would also be lower, because many users would, back then, they would write to our customer support like, hey, I know that there's a discount, but I cannot find it. Can you help me out? That is time and money that it's usually better dedicated to something else. And then, speaking of costs, we talked a lot about infrastructure costs, and this is probably one of the most important ones, lower the dependencies between the teams. So we had 6 teams, as I said, different services and whatnot, and a lot of our problems at roadmap time was, how do you make these features not depending on each other so that the teams don't slow down each other? I mean, yes, you have different domains, but at the seams, you always kind of overlap, and that can be a problem because you have to release something, one team has to release something, but then the other one is working on something else, and it's like, oh, but you can't do this right now, blah, blah, blah. So, fewer costs, more income. How do we fix this from, once we got the green light, because we got it, how do we fix this? It was actually a pretty simple solution in hindsight. We figured out that most of our issues were coming from these many calls happening throughout the system. We kept working on the message bus, the event queue, whatever, so that was still on the table, but that was a long-running project. What is a stepping stone towards that? We figured out that most of the calls were coming from those 2 or 3 services that were calling each other all of the time because they needed to know. I mean, that's the nice part about having different domains, but it's also the painful part where you have to always retrieve a fresh information, especially when it comes to payments, that kind of stuff. You want to make sure that people pay. So this is just an example. It's not what we were using, but I just want to give an idea of what JWT looks like. It's a bunch of encoded information. You can put this, I mean, ends up in your headers of your calls, and you can put whatever information you want in it. And then it's up to the application to figure out how to decode it and whatnot. And you can get pretty much anything. I put there something like, okay, this is the user ID, this is the kind of product they are subscribed to, do they have a subscription when it ends and whatnot. It kind of acts like a cache for that kind of information. And you can add a bunch more, like for example, do they have marketing communication on? What was the last training that they had to, what is the last training that they have to do? So you don't have to keep refreshing that information. We had a 50 minutes expire date for expire time, actually, for that kind of information, but it was still much, much less than we were having in the first place. And this took us probably, we rolled it out over time, but the actual implementation per se, it was pretty simple, so it took us maybe like a week, not even, and it wasn't the whole team working on this. It was our most senior backend engineer. He fixed it, and then we started using it. So of course, it took some time, but it actually helped a lot. So this was the technical solution, the intermediate technical solution. As I said, message bus was the long-term one. Now, what did I learn out of this? again, it's about being, having experience in something at a certain time or in a certain place. What I learned from this, and this is probably something that I keep also experiencing in other companies for other issues, there is really no right solution. There is a right solution for a certain problem, and I wouldn't even call it a right solution because sometimes you have alternatives. And those alternatives are just equally valid as very often a matter of preference. And seldom you are in a place, I mean, most of us don't work, again, for Netflix or for Amazon Prime and that kind of stuff. So the kind of problems that we are going to face are not that cutting edge. There is something out there that you can reuse, and at any point in time, you don't really know if that is what is going to be the right answer to the problem. You're only going to find out once the problem starts showing. So not doing something because you're afraid you're making a mistake or you're afraid that is wrong, that's going to probably cause more pain than actually do something and then fixing it later. The interdisciplinary team was super useful. As I said, that war room was accessible to anyone, so anyone could join. At any point in time, operation team was talking about something, we as backend were saying something else, the client guys were joining and sharing their knowledge, because sometimes the operation team, for example, would identify an issue, but they wouldn't know what the application was doing, because it wasn't their job, right? Like, that's not their area of competence. So we would jump in, but then we are just providing an API. How does the mobile client call the APIs? What's the sequence? How often it happens? That kind of stuff. We as backend engineers, we don't really know. So that's where it's important to have people from all over the technical stack in the company in the same room so that we can fix the problem together. From a business perspective, use the momentum, as I said. Super important because it's fresh information. In a way, people get scared, so they pay attention, they listen to you, so that's also useful. And from a technical perspective, very often we have issues with prioritizing technical debt. If you find a way to connect your problems, even in an indirect way, sometimes you don't have a direct connection, but if you find a way to connect that to what's important to the business, because as was said before, you have to operate as a company, and you have to have a happy team, but if there's no company, there's no team. So actually making money is pretty important. So if you tie the two things together, you're probably gonna have two good things instead of just one. And actually, Ruby on Rails do scale. I mean, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but there's a lot that you can do by optimizing small things, and it's very much more likely that you're going to have problems because of how you design the application than actually hitting the limits of the technology that you are using. So again, it's a good point that of using boring technology, because then you can focus on what's important and what's going to be what's going to have the highest rate of return, and that is how you design your application. And if you don't have to worry about the tools you're using, then you can focus on making it better, and then success. So thank you very much for listening to me. Appreciate the time.